What happens when a royal family becomes so obsessed with keeping power in the bloodline that they marry their own cousins for generations? In 1661, a baby was born who would answer that question in the most horrifying way possible. He couldn't walk until he was at least 4 years old. He couldn't chew his own food. His jaw stuck out so far that he swallowed everything whole. And when doctors finally opened his body after death, they found something that still haunts medical history. But here's what nobody tells you about Charles II of Spain. The autopsy report was just the beginning. What they discovered about how his family created this tragedy goes deeper than anyone imagined. Charles II was born on November 6, 1661, in the Royal Palace of Madrid, and from the first moment, the palace physicians knew something was terribly wrong. The baby's head was abnormally large. His skull bones hadn't properly fused. His body was weak, frail, and constantly shaking. Court doctors whispered among themselves, trying to find polite ways to describe what they were seeing. The priests had a simpler explanation. They said God cursed the child. But here's what nobody wanted to say out loud. Charles was the product of centuries of inbreeding so extreme it defies belief. His father, King Philip IV, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, and if you think that's shocking, wait until you hear this. All 8 of Charles's great-grandparents descended from just 2 people. Where you have 8 different great-grandparents, Charles effectively had 2. His family tree didn't branch out, it collapsed in on itself. Modern geneticists have calculated Charles's inbreeding coefficient at 25. To put that in perspective, that's the same number you'd get if his parents were full brother and sister. Scientists estimate Charles carried identical copies of more than a quarter of his genes, creating a genetic catastrophe that would play out across his entire life. And the signs started immediately. Charles didn't talk until he was nearly 4 years old. When he finally did speak, his words came out slurred and garbled because his tongue was too large for his mouth. He couldn't walk unaided until he was at least 4, and even then he needed leg braces strapped to his weak legs just to stand upright. There were constant reports of convulsions, drooling that never stopped, and fevers that would grip his tiny body for days at a time. But the worst part? His jaw. The famous Habsburg jaw ran in the family, but in Charles it had become monstrous. His lower jaw stuck out so far that his teeth couldn't meet. British envoy Alexander Stanhope would later write something that still shocks historians today. Charles has a ravenous stomach and swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet. Imagine being constantly hungry but physically unable to. Charles had to swallow everything whole, which destroyed his digestive system and caused chronic stomach problems that tormented him for his entire life. When Charles was just 3 years old, his father, King Philip IV, died. And here's where the nightmare truly begins. This child who couldn't walk, couldn't talk properly, and could barely eat was now the King of Spain, the ruler of one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Spanish territory stretched from Europe to the Americas, from the Philippines to parts of Italy, and its king couldn't even dress himself without help. But Charles's mother had a plan to hold on to power, and that plan would trigger a power struggle so violent it nearly destroyed Spain. Charles's mother, Mariana of Austria, seized control as Queen Regent, and for the next 2 decades, she would be the real power behind the Spanish throne. She was deeply religious, heavily superstitious, and relied on priests and confessors to guide every decision. Court painters were given strict orders to make Charles look healthy and strong in his portraits, but everyone inside the palace walls knew the truth. The king was a living puppet. The real problem wasn't just Charles's health, it was John Joseph of Austria, Charles's illegitimate half-brother. And here's what makes this story so dramatic. John was everything Charles could never be. He was Philip IV's son by a famous actress named Maria Calderone, but unlike Charles, John was strong, healthy, and brilliant. He had crushed rebellions in Italy and Catalonia, commanded armies across Europe, and earned respect from nobles who openly wondered why this capable man wasn't king instead of the sickly boy who drooled in council meetings. The tension between mother and half-brother built for years. Queen Mariana had been ruling through a favorite named Fernando de Valenzuela, an uneducated adventurer who somehow became the most powerful person at court. Rumors spread that Valenzuela was the queen's secret lover. Spanish nobles were furious, and John saw his moment. On December 15, 1676, something extraordinary happened. 24 of Spain's most powerful nobles issued a public manifesto demanding that Charles send his mother away, imprison Valenzuela, and install John as his chief advisor. He was only 15 years old, but he managed to slip out of the palace in secret and issue the orders from a safe location. He banished Valenzuela to the Philippines and commanded his mother to leave Madrid. And then, on New Year's Day, 1677, John of Austria marched into Madrid with 15,000 soldiers. There was no battle, no resistance. It was a bloodless coup. For the first time in Charles's life, someone other than his mother was running Spain. The people celebrated in the streets. They thought John would save the empire. But 2 years later, on September 17, 1679, John of Austria died suddenly. Some whispered poison. Others said natural causes. Either way, the Queen Mother returned to power, and the cycle of palace intrigue resumed. Through it all, Charles continued to deteriorate, his body breaking down piece by piece. And here's what nobody talks about. While all this political chaos swirled around him, Charles was supposed to be doing one critically important thing: producing an heir. And that's where the story takes an even darker turn. By the time Charles turned 18, the pressure to marry became overwhelming. The Spanish Empire desperately needed an heir, and the entire Habsburg line hung by a thread. In August 1679, arrangements were finalized for Charles to marry Marie-Louise of Orléans, a 17-year-old French princess and niece of King Louis XIV. When Marie-Louise was told she'd be marrying the King of Spain, she reportedly wept and begged her father to save her. The French ambassador had already described Charles to the royal family as so ugly as to cause fear, and he looks ill. But royal marriages weren't about happiness, they were about power. The wedding went forward with a cousin standing in for Charles at the ceremony in France because Charles was too sick to attend his own wedding. When Marie-Louise finally arrived in Spain and met her husband for the first time, the reality was worse than anything she'd imagined. Charles was physically repulsive, mentally slow, and almost incapable of normal conversation. The rigid Spanish court protocol made her feel like a prisoner. She had left behind her family, her freedom, and everything she knew for this nightmare. But something unexpected happened. Charles fell desperately in love with her. Contemporary accounts describe him following her around the palace like a lost puppy, completely devoted to his young bride. Marie-Louise tried to be kind. She tried to make the best of an impossible situation, and for 10 years they tried desperately to produce an heir. There was just one problem, and this is the part that changed everything. Charles was almost certainly completely infertile. His body simply couldn't function the way it needed to. The Spanish court watched and waited, month after month, year after year. No pregnancy, no heir, just silence. Then, in February 1689, after a day of horseback riding, Marie-Louise complained of severe stomach pain. She went to bed, and her condition rapidly worsened. 2 days later, on February 12, 1689, she died at just 26 years old. Her final words to Charles were heartbreaking. "Many women may be with His Majesty, but none will love him more than I do." Rumors exploded immediately. Had Charles's mother poisoned her to make way for a more fertile wife? An autopsy proved otherwise. Modern doctors believe she died from appendicitis, but for Charles the loss was devastating. He was completely shattered. 6 months later, Charles married again. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen specifically because her family was famous for producing many healthy children. Spanish officials were desperate. Surely this time would be different. But within months, the terrible truth became undeniable. Charles wasn't just infertile. He was completely impotent. His body had failed him in yet another way. There would be no heir. The Spanish Habsburg line would die with him. And as Charles entered his 30s, what happened to his body became the stuff of nightmares. By his mid-30s, Charles had transformed into something that barely seemed human. His skin turned yellow and waxy. His belly swelled grotesquely, his face puffed up, and his eyes often looked glassy and unfocused. He could barely walk even with assistance. He was losing weight, losing strength, and most terrifyingly, losing his mind. Courtiers began whispering a new name for him: El Hechizado, the Bewitched. And here's what's truly disturbing. Charles himself believed it. He became convinced that witches had cursed him, that dark magic was the source of all his suffering. He ordered dozens of exorcisms, surrounding himself with priests who prayed over his broken body while he screamed about demons. He suffered from hallucinations and violent outbursts. His hair fell out in patches, making him look ancient at just 35 years old. And then Charles did something so disturbing that historians still struggle to explain it. He demanded that the coffins of his dead relatives be opened so he could look at their corpses. A mentally unstable king, wasting away in a decaying palace, staring at the decomposing bodies of the family whose inbreeding had destroyed him. On September 28, 1700, Charles became so ill he could no longer swallow food. His advisors knew death was coming. The question of succession had been haunting Europe for decades. Who would inherit the Spanish Empire? France pushed for Philip of Anjou. Austria demanded Charles of Austria. Both sides prepared for war. On November 1, 1700, just 5 days before his 39th birthday, Charles II of Spain died. And what happened next became one of the most infamous autopsy reports in human history. The royal physician wrote words that still echo through medical literature. His body did not contain a single drop of blood, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous, he had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Now, modern scientists don't believe his body literally had zero blood, but the description reveals something crucial. Charles likely suffered from severe hydrocephalus, a buildup of fluid in the brain that causes developmental delays, seizures, and cognitive destruction. The water in his head was real. His single atrophied testicle explained his complete infertility. His tiny, withered heart and damaged organs showed the catastrophic extent of his genetic disorders. Some researchers believe he had aspartyl glucosamminuria, a rare genetic disorder that causes facial deformities, intellectual disability, and organ failure. Others suggest Klinefelter syndrome, pituitary hormone deficiency, or a nightmarish combination of multiple genetic defects all layered on top of each other like a medical horror story. But here's what we know with absolute certainty. Charles II was the result of nearly 200 years of Habsburg inbreeding. His family had been so obsessed with keeping power within their bloodline that they married uncles to nieces, cousins to cousins, generation after generation. And Charles's body paid the ultimate price. Within months of his death, Europe exploded into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal 13-year conflict that would reshape the entire continent. Philip of Anjou eventually took the throne, becoming Philip V and establishing the Bourbon dynasty. The Spanish Habsburgs were finished forever, their dynasty ending not with glory but with a king whose body had become a warning written in flesh and bone. Looking back, it's haunting to realize that Charles II never had a chance. His ancestors chose power over blood, and their dynasty died with him. Which part of Charles's story disturbs you most? Let us know in the comments below.